I'd like to welcome you all today to today's meeting, which is another in our ongoing series on terrorism and homeland security that the Center co-sponsors with the U.S. Army's Eisenhower National Security Series and Georgetown University's Center for Peace and Security Studies. This series provides a forum in which experts can meet to discuss topical issues, and in particular in this series we try to feature distinguished experts from outside of Washington and overseas. Today we have Dr. Shahram Chubin speaking, and it's a tremendous pleasure both to welcome him back to the Woodrow Wilson Center. He will be introduced by Bruce Hoffman, but wanted to welcome you all to today's meeting, which within the Wilson Center is co-sponsored not only by my program, but also my colleague Haleh Esfandiari, who directs our Middle East program. So welcome to today's meeting, another in our ongoing series. Let me turn the floor over to Professor Bruce Hoffman of Georgetown University, who will introduce both the speaker and also offer some introductory comments about the topic. Bruce?
Thanks very much, Rob. Let me also welcome you on behalf of the Woodrow Wilson Center, Georgetown University, and the U.S. Army's Eisenhower series. We're extremely fortunate to have Shahram Chubin as a speaker today. Shahram, I think, for more than a quarter of a century, has really been amongst the most astute and incisive analysts of Iran and of its foreign policy and security evolution. Shahram is currently Director of Studies and Joint Course Director in the International Training Course in Security Policy at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. He's taught at the Graduate Institute for International Studies in Geneva and has also in the past been Director of Regional Studies at the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London and a Fellow at the Wilson Center here as well. He's the author of numerous publications that have appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, International Security, Survival, and so on, and is actually the author of a recently published book titled Iran's Nuclear Ambitions, which has been published by Carnegie. There's probably few topics there's few topics I think right now as pressing and as topical as Iran, its involvement in terrorism and the future course of the regime. Certainly this was one of the things that was cited in the recently released National Strategy for Combating Terrorism, which the National Security Council and the White House released about 2 weeks ago. Certainly Iran's greater activity in this realm after a number of years of quiescence, where we had thought the war on terrorism had addressed the role of state sponsors of terrorism and had sort of beaten them back from previous efforts in this respect, seems to have eroded, especially given the events in Lebanon this summer. So it's extremely timely to have you here, Shahram. Welcome, and thank you very much for coming to address us.
As Shahram moves to the podium, I neglected to mention one important detail for this audience. Usually these meetings occur over lunch in a different room. And today's scenario, because we have a larger crowd, is we're going to be here for about an hour, and then we're going to move to the Moynihan boardroom where there's going to be a stand-up buffet lunch. So lunch will be served. Shahram, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. I always like to come to the Wilson Center. It's a place where I have very good memories and always a very distinguished and demanding audience. And I'm very grateful, Bruce, for your comments, particularly the comment about the resurgence. I think that that's an interesting element of what I'm going to try and talk about. I'm also sort of start with some trepidation because there are people here, Bruce himself, and perhaps one or two of you in the audience, who are experts on terrorism, and certainly there are experts on Iran, greater experts than I. So you will, I hope, find the only original part of my comments to be perhaps the formulation to some extent, not the facts. But let me start with a factoid, as Rob would say, that may or may not be of interest, and that is that there have been more translations of Kant, Immanuel Kant, into Persian over the last decade than into any other language. Now, I don't know if that's relevant or not, but I thought it was interesting. I don't even know if it's true, but I read it. I read that in Prospect magazine. It struck me that some of you theorists might be interested in that. I've written a book on the nuclear issue and nuclear ambitions, and the point I try to make in the book is that the nuclear issue is in fact a symptom of a broader problem, and that is Iran's revolutionary ambitions, or at least some elements in the Iranian leadership's revolutionary aspirations, and their challenge to regional order. And so what I'll do is talk about the regional order, if you like, a little bit in terms of how Iran uses terrorism. And I think the starting point of that would be to look at what is very much in Bruce's book, which is the modern use of the word of terrorism can be traced to the French Revolution and the practice of terror, or the terror by the state. And that's not a bad starting point. As I said, there are several pages on this in Bruce's latest book. Iran's revolutionary regime achieved power through mass support and has maintained it, sustained itself in power through the use of terror. Not exclusively terror, but has used terror against its opponents. The export of the revolution was the primary goal of the regime initially. And when I say initially, I can actually quote that there is a strain in Iran that still believes the export of the revolution is important. In fact, it's perhaps become more important since Mr. Ahmadinejad came in. And quote somebody here in August in the newspaper Hemayat saying that the survival of the revolution, Iran, it cannot be guaranteed without the expansion and exportation of the revolution across international territories. The survival of the Islamic system and the revolution depends on exporting the revolution. Now, this is not just a lunatic saying this. I mean, he may well be a lunatic, but he certainly reflects some elements in the regime. The other introductory quote I want to make is about the stakes. The stakes are, I think, accurately portrayed by President Bush last week when he said that the Iranian regime wants to, and I have it in French here, wants to force America to leave the region, to destroy Israel, and to dominate the greater Middle East. Now, that's a rather sharp way of putting it, but that's more or less captures the spirit that there is competition between the Western order, which is the US-sponsored order, and the Iranian challenge to it. Now, the Iranian regime, as I say, used terror to get into power and to maintain itself, and the export of the revolution has been its primary goal, not just initially, but also to some extent today. And some of the elements of the conspiratorial politics and terrorism are in fact an intrinsic outgrowth of revolutionary politics. And the regime has found it congenial and has been comfortable with that conspiratorial politics. If we could paraphrase Winston Churchill's comment about the Tory party, they act more like a conspiracy than a government. And in power, after 27 years, the government is more like a conspiracy than it is like a government. There's a continuing need, in their view, to bolster the domestic legitimacy by revolutionary activities abroad and to show solidarity to oppressed Muslims in their language. And therefore, they see their legitimacy as bound up with activism. And terrorism is an important instrument in the armory of activism abroad. First, for spreading influence. Second, for projecting power. And third, of course, for weakening adversaries. It's low cost, low risk, and effective. And it's midway between doing nothing and risking confrontation through direct action. I'd like to quote an op-ed piece by an Iranian lady in August, where she writes an article on Tehran and Hezbollah. And she says, the paradoxes of the regime have exposed its hypocrisy, referring to Tehran. On the one hand, the fiery slogans are the raison d'etre of the Islamic Republic. On the other hand, acting openly on those slogans would spell its demise. The most expedient thing to do has been nothing while continuing to chant. Well, I would argue that that's fundamentally mistaken. There is something between revolutionary chants and doing nothing, and that's doing something sub rosa in the terrorist area. Lower cost, it's lower risk, and it is effective, or can be effective. Now, Iran, of course, has had several, if you like, phases of the use of terrorism. In each case, there have been several considerations. One, I've suggested, which is to keep up the momentum of the revolution, which is critical or seen to be critical for the legitimacy of the regime. Another is the extension of influence in the region. And this has become even more important in the context of the American presence in the region and US formulations for a greater Middle East. These are seen as threats to the Islamic Republic, to this Islamic essence of the Republic, and therefore, if you like, it's a defensive activity. You must counter US presence, you must counter US projects in the region, even to the extent you can, directly or indirectly, and preferably indirectly. And the third reason for being active in the region is that Iran aspires to show that it's a regional player, that it has to be consulted on issues in the region, not just in the Gulf, but that it is a large state. It has legitimate right to the status that goes with its importance. Now, the use of terror, of course, terrorism in the 1980s and even up until the mid-90s was characterized by what Thomas Schelling has called violent diplomacy. It was very extensive, very widespread, and it was very much the preferred instrument of policy. That is to say, it wasn't an exceptional instrument of policy. And if you go back, you may not recall this, it wasn't just in the Gulf, Bahrain, Kuwait, Iraq. It was very far afield, all the way across North Africa, and even claims in East Asia that Iran was sponsoring terrorism. It was it was worldwide. And as I say, it was the preferred instrument. There were various uses against enemies of the regime, particularly Iranians. People were killed in the United States, people were killed in Paris, several people were killed in Paris, in Switzerland, in Germany. There were the strategic uses of terrorism in the Iran-Iraq war against the French, against the Americans, and against the Kuwaitis. And thirdly, the export of the revolution, particular attempts to do this in Bahrain and in Kuwait. In the 1990s, we saw Iranian terrorism, and I don't want anyone to get up and say, how can you prove it? But I would allege Iranian terrorism in Argentina at least twice, on the Arabian Peninsula twice, including Al-Kobar, in Berlin, this famous Mykonos case when Kurds were assassinated, and of course Iranian opponents, as I've mentioned, all over Europe. In the 1996-1997 hiatus, when Khatami came in, the focus shifted much more to the risks involved in being state-sponsored. After Al-Kobar, the Americans thought about attacking Iranian installations. They decided not to, but the Iranians sort of swallowed hard and gave it up, except in the Middle East. And this was partly to do with Khatami's attempt to clean up the intelligence agencies, particularly because they had gone rampant within Iran in the so-called serial killers episode, where a lot of Iranian intellectuals and others were killed and stabbed by the security forces. So there were domestic reasons that Khatami tried to stamp it out and reform it. I'll mention the fact that even in the Khatami period, Khatami had less than absolute control. Now, let me suggest to you the domestic drivers for these attitudes. I've mentioned the ideology of export of the revolution, but there's also the strategy. I mentioned the export of the revolution, an active regional presence, and a power to be consulted. But it is also a strategy in an arsenal, in an asymmetrical strategy, because, as I say, it's midway between doing nothing and active or direct confrontation. So, in a way, I would try and distinguish this, and I'll come to it very briefly in a minute, from normal terrorism. You know, terrorism is an indirect strategy. It's intended to spread fear. Targets are indiscriminate, and it's usually for political ends. And when I say it's an indirect strategy, it depends for its effectiveness on the reaction of the target. I would suggest to you that state terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism, is different in a second. And why? But let me get back to the main point that I wanted to make, which is that the domestic drivers, besides the ideology and the strategic uses, I think that people often say everything in Iran is done by consensus. That is, the leadership is consensual. That's true. It's often the case. The nuclear case and other cases are said to be a national decision, a product of consensus. This is in order to protect one faction or another from the criticism if it fails. So it's an attempt to implicate all of the leadership in every decision. But that consensus is very much, the default position of that consensus is hard line. Now, What I think is fascinating is the real possibility that terrorism and the support of terrorism is institutionalized within the system. There's several indications of this. If I mention Khatami, who was recently in town, and his position on the Arab-Israeli issue, and this was true when he was in power, and the episode with the Karine A. I give you two other examples that are actually very significant. Velayati, about a year ago, the former foreign minister for 15 years or so, said, apropos to some other question, he said, I was never in support of terrorism, and those people who practiced terrorism in Europe complicated and made difficult our relations with Europeans. So the foreign minister is disowning it. Rafsanjani, after Al-Khobar, is reported, and I have the text cited, to have told the Saudis that he was never behind the Khobar episode. Now, if all of that is put together with what we know about the Revolutionary Guards, which I'll come to in a second, it would suggest that there are vested interests and institutional elements within the Iranian leadership, not answerable, at least, to some elements of the political leadership. And I think that's a significant point. To some extent, the IRGC is a state within a state, in the same way as Hezbollah is in Lebanon. Let me talk briefly about the types of activities. There's been the direct activity, the direct assassination and so on by Savama, Moïse, and the Al-Quds brigades. Those are usually been against Iranian expatriates. These are direct acts, as far as we can tell. There have been the indirect ones through cutouts like Hezbollah or Saudi Hezbollah. And finally, there have been what Dan Byman calls passive sponsorship, which is, if you like, what Iran is doing with Al-Qaeda. It has hosted a number of leaders. It's kept them under observation, maybe even under house arrest, but it hasn't turned them in. It hasn't, let's say, interrogated them for information about the origins of Al-Qaeda or where the leadership is. So it's a passive sponsor. And then its activities are a number of things. One is as enabler, trainer, financier, sanctuary, and armorer. And it's done this in varying degrees for all of these different groups, including Islamic Jihad and Hamas. Of course, these indirect actions are not directly attributable, they're therefore deniable. The smoking gun is rarely so clear-cut that it leads to a strong reaction. I've mentioned the benefits without the risks. Think of Hezbollah in July this year. I'll come to that very briefly. And I think the key point, though I'm not advocating it, is, though it's worth considering, is that Iran has never paid a high price for its support for terrorism. Compare Iraq, regime change, Syria under UN sanctions, or virtually, Libya under UN sanctions for many years, decided to change its policies, or North Korea. Iran has managed, despite direct attacks on American forces, not to pay a high price. And that makes it difficult within the Iranian leadership to argue against it. If it had paid a high price, it might be more difficult to continue. Now, the Iranian defense of terrorism is, of course, Iran has been a victim of terrorism. The Mujahideen have targeted Iranian leadership. It's a victim as much as it is, as it were, an active player. That, of course, resistance is not terrorism. We've always had this argument, as you know, in the UN, not just Iran, lots of countries. Terrorism is something the US does, and that's the third point. The US is the biggest terrorist. It uses cluster bombs and depleted uranium and so on. Well, what's new about all this? Well, I would suggest there are a few points. One is, in a nutshell, the same people in charge of the security of the nuclear installations are also the people who are manage ties with terrorist groups. Now, if you think about it, that's quite serious, because it suggests all sorts of things, at least to me, and I've elaborated them a bit in my book. But basically, it means that you can't be sure that there won't be some leakage of nuclear materials, either for ideological reasons or for commercial reasons. Let me suggest that the Revolutionary Guards resemble, to some extent, the PLA of about 15 years ago. That is, they are now a business. They are a business as much as they are a military organization. They don't compete for projects. They get them without any tender. They have their own ports. They were buying oil from Saddam Hussein and selling it into their own pockets. It wasn't accountable to the government. They are a business as much as they are anything else. So they're a commercial organization. And they have become much more important in the last few years as political actors since Mr. Ahmadinejad has come in, and even before. They reinforce, if you like, the hardliners in the Iranian regime with this ascendancy of the hardliners and the ideological component. I think that's worth considering. Again, that goes along with what I was saying earlier about vested interests and interest groups. There's a certain inertia that makes it difficult for the Iranian leadership, if it's a moderate leadership, which is rare, but when it is, to arrest actions, particularly if the costs have not been shown to be there. Iran has been fairly ecumenical, if that's the right word, in its use of terrorist groups. I mean, it's supported Hezbollah, it's supported the Mahdi army, supported Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and to some extent it's in dialogue with, or at least implicit or tacit dialogue with, some elements of Al-Qaeda. So there's been this crossover element that terrorist specialists talk about, from the Shia to the Sunni, from the state-sponsored to the transnational, if you like. And it raises a number of questions. For example, if the future of the region is going to be one of regional polarization, whether on Sunni-Shia lines or revolutionary status quo lines, what will the use of terrorism be there? And what will be the use of terrorism in the shadow of a nuclear capability? The juxtaposition of suicide bombings and WMD possession, for example, and of course the scope for opportunism and misjudgment, and also the willingness to probe through terrorism while keeping nuclear weapons to sanctuarize the homeland. Now, I'd like to make a couple of comments about state-sponsored versus transnational terrorism, and I'm willing and actually anxious to be corrected. But it seems to me that state-sponsored terrorism on the Iranian line are different from transnational terrorism. Because, of course, state-sponsored terrorists have an address. So therefore, in theory, they should be deterrable. But in practice, it's actually very difficult to pinpoint responsibility. And even if you can pinpoint responsibility, when you get the smoking gun, there are all sorts of reasons not to do something if the state is important. And Iran has been important enough, more important than North Korea or Syria or Libya, to escape punishment, because Iran is an important state. There are all sorts of arguments why not. For example, the argument against a response to Al-Qaeda was, first, the Saudis didn't want it, but the other reason was, Mr. Khatami's just come into power. We might be able to make a deal. So, in fact, the fact that there's an address doesn't necessarily result in it being deterrable at all. A little quote here that, I try and read these things, from an American paper. Several intelligence officials, this is in reference to the US, said that American agencies have made assessments in recent weeks that despite established ties between Iran and Hezbollah and a well-documented history of Iran arming the organization, there was no credible evidence to suggest either that Iran ordered the Hezbollah raid that touched off the recent fighting, or that Iran was directly controlling attacks against Israel. There are no provable signs of Iranian direction on the ground, said one intelligence officer in Washington. Nobody should think that Hezbollah is a remote-controlled entity. Does Iran profit from all this? Yes, said General Wayne Downing, the retired former commander of special operations. But is Iran pulling the strings? The guys I'm talking to say no. So it's a nice, you provide 10,000 or 12,000 missiles, you have common aims, you don't necessarily control things, but when events occur like a conflict, you then restock arms or provide more weapons to that group, or more funds to that group in order to maintain itself. I think that state-sponsored use of terrorism, or if you like, I'll be more direct, Iran's use of terrorism in the current format is more akin to an insurgency or low-level war than it is to terrorism, classical terrorism. That is to say, the aim is to impose costs and attrition on the other side, including the US, to change its politics and its calculus, in some cases drive the occupier out, or to bleed the occupier, in the case of Iraq. And here the line between terrorism and insurgency seems to me very thin, particularly because a lot of these attacks are in fact targeted attacks. They're not indiscriminate attacks. They're attacks on the US and the US military quite often. They're not indiscriminate attacks intended to generally create a climate of fear. They're intended to change the political calculus. So I think that state-sponsored terrorism is to some extent a little bit closer to the way the Iranians use it anyhow, to a form of insurgency, and ideally in the end you get the Hezbollah model where it becomes a full-scale insurgency, particularly prior to 2000. The Hezbollah model, I just mentioned, of course, that has inspired the Mahdi army, and some of the Hezbollah and the Mahdi army fought together in Najaf in 2004. We know that there's some transfer of equipment from Hezbollah to the Mahdi army. The Hezbollah model is supposed to be inspirational. And of course, there's an asymmetry in the sense that, as we saw in the last events in July, if Hezbollah doesn't actually lose, it wins. Now, we can argue about that, but at least there's a certain asymmetry here as to if a state can't actually impose itself, the other side looks as if it's a model of resistance. And it creates problems. Let me simply make a few concluding comments. One is, in theory, the risks of practicing terrorism have increased post 9/11. But against this are reasons why the Iranians are in fact probing by using more terrorism than they did in between 1996 and 2002. One is, of course, US entanglement in Iraq is a constraint, or is thought to be a constraint. Second, the US regional presence is maybe a threat, but it's also a vulnerability. And here it's rather interesting if you think of it. The Iranians, Mr. Maliki is in Tehran, the Iranians are calling for a quick pullout of the US from Iraq. I don't think they really want that. If the US were to pull out tomorrow from Iraq, it would be far less vulnerable and have forces freed for an attack on Iran. So I think the Iranians are taking a calculated gamble that the US is going to stay in Iraq, and they would prefer that and to bleed it and to keep it entangled rather than have them withdraw. In any case, the regional presence is also a vulnerability. There's also the fact that Iran has increased self-confidence since 2003 because of the US quagmire in Iraq and because the hardliners have been in the ascendancy, because it's a more ideological regime, and because they have more revenues. Oil revenues having tripled, I think, in the last 4 years. So I think they have a greater propensity to pursue an irregular conflict with the US presence. And they have advantages in this asymmetrical conflict. And it's a way of signaling, and in a way lots of commentators pointed this out, signaling to the US its resolve and its options. The Lebanon events, whatever you think of it, were in some ways a proxy war. And Israel's overreaction was clearly intended to tell the Iranians that you cannot fool around with us now, and to draw a line against the possibility that one day Iran might have nuclear weapons, and it was important for Israel to establish its deterrent credibility now. There was a lot of that, quite apart from the question of Hezbollah and the intrinsic stakes in Lebanon. Academics talk about strategic culture, and they say that it's not quickly or easily changed. It's learned, and it's historical, and it takes time. And one question is, of course, what would the possession of nuclear weapons in the possession of such a state mean? There's the other element, which is, Rob and I have often talked about, which is the ambiguity, which is carefully cultivated and even studied by the Iranians about what they really want. In the same phrase that they talk about enrichment capabilities for energy, They say, what about Israel or Pakistan? Don't we have the same rights? Now, nobody has accused Israel or Pakistan of being very, very keen on nuclear enrichment for civil purposes, and certainly not for exporting enriched uranium. So the Iranians elide from peaceful uses to strategic benefits in the same sentence. And there's this ambiguity about really what they're talking about. Are they talking about well, there's ambiguity or not, but it's intended to be ambiguous. Let me just conclude by saying that what does this all lead us to? Well, I think it leads us to one thing. All the focus on the nuclear program is mistaken. If you had a technical fix on the nuclear program tomorrow, you know the package, whether it's the June 2005 or the June 2006 package, there are some elements there about possible security guarantees, or at least elements of that. And it's clear that you couldn't possibly have a security guarantee associated with the nuclear, a nuclear agreement, because that would imply that Iran's behavior across the board in other areas is acceptable. What I'm suggesting to you is that a nuclear fix, if there is one, a technical fix on the nuclear, whether it's an agreement on suspension for a certain time, or even a Russian proposal of enrichment in Russia and so on, can only be the starting point for dealing with the broader challenge that Iran represents in the region as the spoiler in the Arab-Israeli conflict and as the promoter of a different regional order through terrorism. So what I'm suggesting is that the Libyan model, that is to say an across-the-board agreement of policy change on the part of the Iranians, has to be the ultimate aim of this administration. Dealing with the nuclear issue will only postpone dealing with the broader issue. If you like, the Pakistani agreement is, the Pakistani model is, we'll look the other way on the nuclear as long as you cooperate with us on the terrorism. Well, in a sense, it's a reverse of what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that if you deal with Iran, you're not likely to have a nuclear agreement in which you say, all right, you can do what you like on the terrorism front. We're not worried about that. Let's just deal with the nuclear. So you really do have to deal with all of those aspects at once. And if that's the case, then it seems to me any nuclear agreement, temporary nuclear agreement, can only be a partial agreement leading to a full agreement on the Libyan model. My last point simply is that that may sound fanciful to you, but my reading, and I don't have time, I'll leave this dangling for you, my reading of what's happening in Iran is that, in fact, the elite is very split on this, and you could call it the realists and the ideologues. The ideologues are Larijani and Ahmadinejad, maybe Khamenei. On the other side, you have Rouhani, Rafsanjani, and Khatami. And they are the realists, in my view, or the less extremists, and they're prepared to make a deal as long as the legitimate interests of the regime are maintained. And it's not just a deal in which they stay in power. It's also a deal in which Iran evolves into becoming a normal state rather than a revolutionary state. And that Iran is organized in ways that you've seen Khatami express it, more plural, more tolerant, more accountable government. They have a very, very different idea about how Iran ought to evolve, and have said so in as many words, in guarded ways, than our other friends in power today, who have, as you've seen, started installing within Iran, they've gone through the first installment of how they see the future of Iran, which is desecularized, no liberal professors at the universities, no satellite receivers, and so on. So, in a sense, all this foreign policy stuff really is very much linked to domestic politics and will have an outcome. For example, if the hardliners are rewarded by an agreement, will have an outcome on domestic politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a remarkable presentation, perhaps one of the clearest exegeses on Iran that we've heard in some time, so thank you very much. I'm sure there are questions. Please identify yourself, both by name and institution. Yes, sir.
Dick Pulaski, I'm on the Armed Services Committee in the House, but I'm speaking for myself, of course. The question is really, can Iran eventually move to some normality where we can deal with it? but I want to ask the question in a different way because, first of all, you didn't bring up any of the middle class issues about this abused middle class, which is just waiting for a change. But I want to ask it from a Western context, and particularly now since we're doing a lot of negotiating on rules of war, and we're dealing with this inch-by-inch movement to the abyss, so to speak. So some right-winger might ask the question, is Iran worth saving? And that's the way I'd like to ask that question and to see from a viewpoint.
Is Iran worth saving from itself? Well, of course it is. This is a very talented people. The country is important. As you said rightly, the constituency of the hardliners is not the middle class. It's not the educated. It's not even the urban elements. As far as I can see, it's the people who benefit from it, the patronage, whether it's the Revolutionary Guards, the Basij, and some of the peasants in the rural areas who don't subscribe necessarily to the foreign policy, but subscribe to the fundamental principles of the revolution that Ahmadinejad ran on, his ticket ran on, which is no corruption and a little bit more social equity. So they support that. But there are two different constituencies. What I call the realists depend on this middle class, which has grown, and the hardliners depend on the absolutists and the very poor. And it's not by any means clear with the demographics that the hardliners and the ideologues will, in the long run, or the medium run, prevail. Of course, that's no use when you're dealing with a nuclear time frame. But of course it's worth saving. It's a great country with a great culture. And it's in some ways, the religion has been instrumentalized by a small group of people.
Just a small follow-on is that who's going to keep reminding us of that so we don't go off the deep end? And that's really where I wanted to go. And who's going to remind us of all the value that Iran brought throughout history?
I think the Iranians will. They don't cease to trade on it, I must say. In Geneva, we had the Iranian foreign minister give a talk, a public talk, which was attended by a lot of the missions. And somebody asked a technical question about enrichment, and he said, in Persian, and it was translated, but he said, do you really think a culture that's capable of coming up with these beautiful carpets, with these tiny microscopic knots per square centimeter, and with colors unheard of in the Western spectrum, do you really think that we would want to get enrichment for weapons? Now, anybody who can weave an argument like that is...
Yes, Barbara.
Some microphone.
Hi, Barbara Slavin of USA Today. I just wanted to question a little bit your division in the internal politics of Iran. Having met Larijani and some of the people close to him, I question whether he is not closer to the realists and that camp than he is to Ahmadinejad, and also whether Khamenei is not closer to the realists than Ahmadinejad. And also your analysis of how the Revolutionary Guard, again, I know they're not a monolith, would regard a deal with the West, how that their concerns about whether their prerogatives and their commercial interests would be maintained. Thanks.
I think it's a very good question, and I only make the analysis in a tentative way. My feeling is that Larijani is, and I've read other experts, more expert than me, saying that Larijani is a realist. I've never seen any sign of it. And not only that, in the things he says and the things he was saying. Don't forget, Larijani was breathing over the shoulders of Mr. Rouhani throughout the whole period he was negotiating. But I step back and say that so that the default consensus was hard line, and it was only Rouhani's turban that protected the moderates when he was negotiating. And they had to take positions because of these people breathing down their necks that completely alienated the EU3. Selling the same car twice, or selling the car without the wheels, and all these other types of, bazari suggestions that the West has made as a result of that experience. I think that Larijani is a hardliner and wants, and I think Khamenei is very much as well. I think that the article Slackman wrote the other day is exactly right in the sense of this is payback time to the reformists for having questioned his supreme authority in that period. And he's Ahmadinejad would not have got this leeway. He's not on a leash. He does what he wants. Khatami was never anywhere in that position. Why? The supreme leader allows it. Why does he allow it? One, because Ahmadinejad has a constituency that's important to the security of the regime, and two, because he believes it. Khamenei believes it. And his statements are very close. I think Larijani is in the same category. Extremely nationalistic and extremely intent on revolution. They depend on different constituencies, the two groups, and the Revolutionary Guards and others. The implication of the Rafsanjani when he ran belatedly in that, and I guess I look at Hadi and others who could correct me, when he ran belatedly and more or less under pressure in 2005, the only things he said about foreign policy is globalization is a reality, we have to focus on it, we have to accept it. And that implies regime change from within, because you then depend on the middle classes, the commercial classes, the young, and you have to get away from all those other people, the pillars of the revolution. That implies a real change. These other guys have decided that they prefer, to go back to what the pure, pristine values of the regime, and that means depending on the other group. That constituency is very different.
And the Red Guards, they're interested in a deal?
I don't think they'd be interested in a deal. I mean, if Iran became a normal state, what would be the need for Revolutionary Guards? You'd have a normal military. You'd have an accountable government. You'd worry less about internal security. You wouldn't have hundreds of thousands of kids dressed up as Basijis, as thugs. You'd get rid of the Ansar Hezbollah, and these are whatever the groups are within the country that are vigilantes. It's a very serious division, I think, between the two. And in a way, it reflects the ambivalence in the society itself about its Islamic identity and its Iranian identity, its Islamic revolutionary identity and the Iranian nationalist identity.
Yes, sir.
Larry Wood, Headquarters DA. Based on your analysis, I can only conclude that we should expect more of the same in the near term, the pattern that's evolving. If you're advising U.S. policymakers, then what course should we take as a nation to combat this reality that you've described for us?
Well, I can suggest a few things not to do. One is not to say things that you can't implement. And think carefully about that before you say it, because every time you step back, you lose credibility. Secondly, it's to realize that the elite is not monolithic. Despite the fact that they agree on certain things, and there's a key point. I mean, both elites agree on the system. Khatami is a supporter of the system. That's why he's so reviled by the students. He never confronted the system. He's within the system. So, in a sense, and so is Rouhani and Rafsanjani, they both want the system to survive. They both believe that Iran should play a more active role and that nationalism is an important ingredient of this. And they all believe that Iran should get nuclear technology. But they have very different ideas as to one, what that technology would be for. One group wants it to confront the U.S., to level the playing field and have the equalizer, and to confront the U.S. on its own terms. The other is prepared to do a Libyan model where you recognize the regime, you basically don't threaten it, and they give up all these activities. They put them all on the table: spoiler, terrorism, and any weapons capability. So, and they have very different ways, as I just implied in the last question, very different views of how Iran ought to be organized. Khatami was here last week, he talks about the coexistence of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Very, very different, an accountable government, a pluralist system. The other group, you don't hear these words. You hear about destroying Israel and Supreme Guide's absolutely infallibility. So they have very different, the stakes are not just external, they're domestic. They have very different visions of how Iran ought to be organized. What you ought not to do is to make a deal with the hardliners that underlines that there are benefits to being hardline, because you would undermine the moderates. It's not a good idea to talk about regime change, because that stigmatizes any internal dissent as part of regime change. If you want regime change, you should go about it quietly. I don't think it's a practical proposition myself. I think the only regime change is from within, amongst these groups themselves. But What else not to do? As I said before, don't confront the regime because it unites everybody, not to mention the diaspora that goes crazy abroad. The strongest supporters of Iran's nuclear aspirations are the diasporas abroad. But that's always true of diasporas, as you know. Don't talk about confrontation. Talk about just squeeze them. The economic squeeze is significant. Even a statement in the Security Council that stigmatizes Iran as without any sanctions, that the Security Council passes a resolution that says Iran is a quasi-pariah state for its behavior in the nuclear issue and not giving full transparency to the IAEA, would have domestic repercussions because Iranians don't want to be stigmatized as North Korea. They don't think they are. Not to mention the informal sanctions that are already taking place on the economic side. Those economic sanctions are important. Final point is that people often say, well, we don't want to do the mistakes of Iraq, so we want targeted sanctions. Well, which targets? If you confiscate assets abroad, you're going to be confiscating Mr. Rafsanjani's money abroad, not Mr. Ahmadinejad's. And that's not a good idea, because he's the right person to support. If you put a travel ban on it, Mr. Ahmadinejad came and saw, I don't know what, he had a rapture in the General Assembly last year. I don't think he'll miss coming to the General Assembly again. So I think you need to target the Iranian population. I hate to say this, because unlike Saddam Hussein, the regime is sensitive to domestic disquiet. If people go out on the street and say we don't have enough oil, or why has the price of imported gasoline become triple, or whatever, or why is the market so completely flat, and even flatter, why the small Gulf states doing so well with this oil boom, and we're experiencing inflation and nothing else? Those things would count. The regime would notice that. And then the moderates could say to the Supreme Guide, this is a very costly process. We didn't have any of this before. Mr. Rouhani, when he accepted the EU3 proposal in Tehran to suspend and to accept the additional protocol, made it very clear within Iran, trying to tell the conservatives, he said, everywhere we looked, not just the Europeans, Australians, the Japanese, everybody convinced us that we should do this. And for economic reasons, we did. We don't want to have bad relations with the rest of the world. But these characters are flush with oil money, and unless they can be squeezed economically, and unless the Iranian people can see there's a price to be paid for these activities. Now, again, I haven't answered your question. It's hard to find the right lever. But it seems to me the squeezing rather than the confronting is very important.
One quick follow-up. In this same forum over the last few months, we've learned that many al-Qaeda leadership actually has safe haven in Iran, and yet you only tangentially acknowledged al-Qaeda. Mm-hmm. What role is the current Iranian regime playing in regard to that al-Qaeda leadership that's still present under its borders?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I don't have the secret information, but I think the following. What's interesting is, and especially because I don't have secret information, it's interesting that Iran hosted them in 2000, after 2001, 2002, at the most dangerous possible time. I mean, the U.S. was then, on a roll, and the Iranians were scared as hell until the end of 2003, until the Iraq quagmire became clear and evident. And I think there are a number of explanations, and the one I heard from the Iranians when I've talked to them, the officials, is, and it sounds plausible to me, it's very much sort of modus operandi, and I didn't mention, I should have, I had it in my notes, the different ways Iran uses these ties. For example, the PKK. It has ties with the PKK as leverage on Turkey, as a bargaining card. I think a lot of Islamic Jihad and so on is also a bargaining card, It's, we're a player in the region. If you want us to stop doing this, you stop doing that. We're there. It's another card. And I think with al-Qaeda, I was told by the Iranians, look, we may be the targets of al-Qaeda, and we want to keep these guys here as hostages. If they screw around with us, these guys go. So that sounds plausible to me. As I call them passive sponsor. I mean, they're there. But obviously that was a huge problem for the US, and that's why the May 2003 discussions never went anywhere. The May 2003 discussions in Geneva about a real settlement across the board after Afghanistan and the beginnings of Iraq, the Americans pulled the rug on those discussions, and I remember talking to American officials concerned in the NSC, and they said that the president doesn't want to talk to people who host killers of American civilians. And I can understand that, but it's a little inflexible. I mean, the Middle East is full of this stuff, and we all know in intelligence and so on, you don't even know who's on your side half the time. You have to talk to everybody, and if you can make a deal, you can get rid of the problem much more easier than taking this strong ideological stand. But it's cost the Iranians at that point, and I'd say now it's cost the US that inflexibility, because at that point the US was at its maximum leverage and power vis-a-vis the regime. My last point is, engage or not engage. Of course you have to engage the regime, but the question is not whether you engage them, the question is on whose terms you engage them. And you don't want to engage them when you're weak. So you want to get back to the position you were just after the military victory in Iraq. You can somehow get into a position where you engage the Islamic Republic when it feels vulnerable and weak, and you feel strong. If you engage the Islamic Republic today, you are the demander, and the terms are not going to be necessarily what you want.
I'm afraid we're virtually out of time, but let me collect two last questions, and then we can break for lunch. The gentleman all the way in the back, and Professor Samadi.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm Dave Pollack. I'm from the State Department. And I wanted to ask how you could apply some of these ideas that you're suggesting to the specific issue of Iranian influence in Iraq. What kind of deal could we make, do you think, and how would we get to it on issues of Iranian support for, as you said, the Mahdi army and other disruptive forces in Iraq? And how does that tie in your view, with the other issues of nuclear capabilities and broader spoiler role in the region? Thank you.
And Professor Samati, up front here with Professor Samati.
Hadi Samati. I have a basic disagreement with you, Shahram, on the concept whether Iran is a revolutionary state anymore or not, which I believe it's not. It's actually gone beyond that position to be in search of a status quo position. But that aside, most of your elements in this conceptualizing terrorism as a tool basically falls under the banner of a strategic value of terrorism rather than ideological predisposition that exists in the regime, which would lead me to believe, or at least to ask you, if that is true, that means that it is bargainable in a way. And in what sense that could be bargainable? Is it, and I do believe since 1990, if you accept the proposition that 1996 Khobar Tower was indeed a work at least support of Iran, from then on we haven't seen any concrete example of state-sponsored terrorism, or at least terrorism by Iran, with the exception, of course, you could say, support for Hamas and Islamic Jihad. So I think that transformation is evolving still, in my judgment, to a more status quo power. And strategic value of terror, therefore, falls under the banner of a larger deal that they're in search of. Could you see any possible way that they could be talked to and a bargain could be struck where the use of violence as strategic asset would be just gone away, or at least eroded gradually?
Well, let me start with your question. I think that, or your comment, I think that that's true, that it's a strategic asset. It's not just ideological. But once you deal with it, it's an ideological issue. What I mean by that is, what is it in favor? What is it intended for? It's intended to show that Iran has options in the region to confront the U.S. or to pursue its regional goals through Hezbollah and through the others, whether as a bargaining card or not. The problem with making a deal with it is that what did the other side do in exchange? You know as well as I do, there's a lot of hot air in Iran. But besides the hot air, there are real perceptions. And this administration has a very, very different view of the U.S. position than the previous one. Though, for example, I've seen statements by advisors to Ahmadinejad, and even statements by Khamenei as well, saying basically the U.S. is organizing the region around the axis of Zionism and subservient governments. And therefore, the front line of the defense of Iran in the Gulf is in Palestine. Now, there's a very different argument from saying the Palestinians are oppressed Muslims. It's our duty to help. There's a strategic competition in their view. So Hezbollah is part of that strategic, it's an arm. It has its own goals, it has its own decisions, but it overlaps. Now, the problem in a sense is a little bit it gets back to the first question, which is, under what conditions do you give up this arm? Well, the U.S. recognizes you. The U.S. presence becomes no longer a threat to you. Maybe it's even reduced, and so on and so forth. And it leads to this question of Iraq. You could, in theory, make bilateral deals. You could make deals on issues like Iraq, because I would say 90% of Iranian U.S. interests overlap in Iraq. Iran wants a united country. It wants a democratic country, meaning the Shia should be represented properly. It wants a stable country, and it doesn't want an Arab nationalist or an Islamically radical country. In many ways, these things overlap with U.S. interests. The bone of contention really is who is going to have dominant influence between those two countries. Is it the U.S. or is it Iran? And that tactically, the real difference is what I mentioned earlier about the U.S. The U.S. being there and being bled is more convenient for the Iranians than the U.S. leaving. The U.S. leaving presumably would be leaving a real problem on the doorstep of Iran. Presumably, if it's not settled very quickly, and I don't see it being settled quickly, that is a civil war going on its doorstep, with Iran being blamed in the region, increased regional polarization, which I referred to, possibly Iranian involvement on a larger scale than exists today, and therefore anything the Shia do, the Sunnis would see as Iranian. I mean, the Iranians are playing a game where a U.S. withdrawal, precipitate U.S. withdrawal, is dangerous on both grounds. The U.S. frees up its assets, and the region is in turmoil right next door. On the other hand, they like the fact the U.S. is there. They can blame the U.S. for everything. They can say that the reason there's all of this is the U.S., and of course the U.S. is entangled. But let me make another point, and this is why I made the point about the technical fix. The Iranians have said many times, and I refer to this in the book, and they've said it many times since, that there's an insecurity about negotiating with the U.S., which is that if you negotiate on this issue, then, we're talking about human rights, animal rights, women's rights, and, everything down the spectrum, and you'll be asking us to change everything and negotiating ourselves out of existence. So this sort of slippery slope idea leads one to suggest that you're not going to get a limited agreement. You need a total agreement. It seems to me the only way. A bit on analogy with the Arab-Israeli problem. You need a total concept of what you're going to agree upon across the board, so you don't have the sense that, as soon as we meet them there, they'll want something else, and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much, Shahram. This has been an excellent discussion. Lunch is served adjacent to this room. Please join me in thanking Shahram Chubin for an excellent presentation.
Thanks. What I like is this. You like this Churchill quote about the Tories. They're more like a conspiracy than a party.
Bomb for Kilcullen.